Now, so welcome to week 4, the module on cities as part of Greening the Economy, Lessons from Scandinavia. I'm Jessica Luth Richter. You might remember me from week 1. I'm a PhD student here, and I'm here with our director of the IIIEE, Lena Ney. And what we're going to start out talking is a bit about this module and why we focused on cities as part of Greening the Economy. Why are cities so important?
Cities are growing all over the world, and there are becoming more cities than we actually have today. And they contribute to approximately 70% of the total energy-related greenhouse gases. So the climate sort of contribution or climate change contribution is essential from the cities. Not only climate-related problems, but also social problems, environmental problems are related to the cities. And there are huge challenges when it comes to the urbanization process. But at the same time, as you already know, there are possibilities in order to make a difference in the cities. And that, I think, we really need to focus on in the future.
Yeah, and we see in the forum some examples of cities, and through the assignments as well, we have some greening of cities and some greening by cities. One thing that's been asked is, are there more examples from the region? What's happening now in this region?
Yeah, and you can find so many good examples, I would say, are all over the world. And we have many good examples in the Scandinavian region, both down here in the Öresund region, in Stockholm, in the countries of Denmark, Finland, Norway. There are a number of sites being developed in a very, I would say, new way. So we are trying it out more like experiments. We are evaluating to find out what is actually a good, a more sustainable solution when it comes to building up the cities of the future. And just to give you one example, I have one building in Malmö that is my favorite one.
Yeah.
It's built in the Western Harbor. It's energy efficient. It's called in Swedish the Fullrökegränd, just for those of you who've been there or would like to go there. It's located in a very nice area close by the sea. It's a lot of public transport in the area. But when you buy an apartment at this house, you don't only buy sort of the apartment as such, but in the basement they have a carpool. And they have all different cars of types of cars that you can use when living in these buildings. There are trucks, there are family cars.
And it's all shared.
It's all shared. So you're part of that. So you can use the public transport. Of course, you can use your bike and you can walk in the area because you're quite well located to the center of the city, but you also have the possibilities to use all different kinds of cars and
when
environmental friendly cars.
Yeah. Okay. And then you don't need to have your own car because it's already provided as part of the service of living in this.
And it's new kinds of these kinds of solutions that we need to develop for the future.
Yeah, it sounds very interesting. And I mean, what is the institute, the IIIEE, doing as part of this? What's key to this process?
We are part in many different ways, sort of in the planning process, and we can be partners to discuss with. We're also part of evaluating the different projects being developed. But I think what's most important in this process is that we do collaborate. So we, within academia, we collaborate with the cities, we collaborate with the business, with the private partners, social partners in the area. And I just have to say that it's challenging, but it's really fun, this process of collaborating.
Yeah. So we're both part of it and working with a lot of other actors.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we'll keep track of what the Institute is doing in this work as well, and we've got a lot of examples coming in from the students too on what's happening in their city. So it's good to see that this is not only happening in Scandinavia but around the world, but that there's some really interesting models that we can get from this region too.
Yeah, and we welcome everyone to come here and to visit us.
Yes,
to learn more about what we're doing in this region.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, Lena. What we'll do now is we'll take some of the questions that came up in the forums this week, and we're going to have 2 other researchers from the Institute come join us. But we thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And thanks for sharing. Okay. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I've got with me now Kaz McCormick, who you've seen a lot of during this course as well. And I've got somebody who you haven't seen as much of yet. This is Norris Manvi, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves a little bit, and Kaz will just remind you who he is, and we'll hear what Nora is doing here at the Institute as well.
Yeah, hi, my name's Kaz McCormick, and I'm an associate professor here at the Institute. Hopefully you've seen me a few times in the films online. I'm that Australian guy who was probably a bit unexpected when you signed up to a course on lessons for Scandinavia. But yeah, I work here at the Institute predominantly on the broad sustainability issues, but also with a pretty big focus on cities and urban development. So that's why I've been a big part of this module on cities.
And hi, I'm Norris Manvi. I'm a PhD student here at the IIIEE. My research is on local governance, looking at energy and environmental issues. Specifically, I look at the building sector and how to steer towards more energy efficient buildings at the local level.
Okay, so we've got two people here who can give us a lot of insight into not only what's happening here in Scandinavia, but the process of urban sustainable transitions in general. And we had a few questions from the forums that came up that were hotly discussed during the week. So one of those questions, which I'll start with, was about cars in the cities and how to deal with cars and what is politically viable to deal with cars. Are bans a solution in cities? And just wondering what your thoughts are on this. Should we be banning cars in cities? Can we ban cars in cities?
I mean, I think, look, it's a great question. And I think the first thing we should say about the forums is that there's really a lively debate in the forums across many different topics. And it's actually fantastic to see. And I think it's something that we're really thankful with the course, that there is so much debate going on and so many students going in and not just asking questions, but also talking to each other and giving ideas. And I was just in before looking at a group of students from Brazil who are all writing in Portuguese and communicating with each other. So it's fantastic. But jumping to the question of cars, look, it's a huge question, and obviously transportation and cities are very much intertwined. And I think you've got to go back a little bit first and remember that the way we've designed our cities, they've been designed for cars. They've put cars in focus, and in fact, they took people out of focus in many ways. So many of the cities around the world have been designed specifically for the motor car to get around very easily. And now we're seeing the consequences of that, of having designed cities in this way to just be focused on cars. And there's some very big impacts and problems with that. And we're seeing a few cities around the world testing different ideas to reduce car use. I mean, I think the term ban, as we discussed before we came online, is a very strong word. And perhaps banning cars is one way to think about it. But I think another way to think about it is that we need to make cities more attractive in terms of other transportation choices. And here in Scandinavia, you see that in many of the cities. The cities have great transportation systems, public transportation, biking. We ride bikes, we take the public transportation here. There's many different options to get around. So there's a big part there around making other options more attractive in combination with perhaps making cars less attractive, which could mean bans or congestion charges or so on. So there's many different parts to this big question. But I think Nora can probably add a few other points here as well.
Yeah, well, of course, it's when it comes to the bans, I still think we should consider it as an option, but it doesn't have to be so drastic. If we look at, for example, how they've been working in Copenhagen, an old example is in Nyhavn, which used to be a shopping area next to the sea, and then they wanted to take away the cars and make it into more of a recreational area. And the shop owners there, they were very skeptical about this. We will lose all our customers in the area because they cannot take their car there to go shopping. But instead, it turned out very successful. It became a very attractive recreational area. So people maybe didn't do as much shopping there, but they went there for coffee, for drinking beer, for having a good life.
And then they use the shops by default by making the area more attractive for people. Yeah. They had more people going.
So I think we can work with it step by step, but how do we convert areas so they become more livable, more attractive for walking, for people, because the car environment is not attractive for people. So that's one aspect of it.
Yeah, and what you're describing there with turning a place into a pedestrian-only place is in effect a ban, but it's been framed maybe a different way that doesn't seem so harsh. It's more that this is now a pedestrian area where pedestrians are favored over the cars.
And if you have a street where cars are favored strongly, then you could say that the bikes are banned somehow, implicitly. So it's just a matter of whom do you prioritize, whom do you plan for, whom do you put at the center. And there I think it's a lot of interesting work with having prioritized bike lanes, for example, which makes it much more convenient.
And framing. Yeah, I've heard a lot that some of the congestion problems might also be from the way we approach a problem of how many cars will we have in the future, therefore how many roads do we need, might be a way that a traffic planner plans, and that we need to reframe it instead to how many people need to get from point A to point B, and how do we plan our cities for that.
Exactly, because the more, if we make it convenient to go by car, then of course more people will use the car, and then we make it even more convenient to go by car, because then we build more roads if we just adapt after the car.
I think that came up in the module as well, about the reason a lot of people bike in Copenhagen is not for environmental reasons, but actually convenience. And that's something that then the planning of the city is integral to making it actually more convenient to go by your bicycle than to go by car in Copenhagen.
But of course, in big cities, it's not always an option to bike still. And public transport is really key. How can we travel together in different ways? We have metros or trams, but that can also be very expensive. Happening, for example, instead work with bus rapid transport, which is a form of bus, but is taking some of the advantages from rail-bound traffic. So it doesn't have as many stops, and it's also a matter of prioritization. So they can go faster through the city and become a very good option instead of cars.
I think we can also say what Scandinavia's been doing very well is that we don't know how to plan or create a sustainable city. It's not a technical challenge. It's not so easy to say we do this, this and this and everything will work. I think what we see in all the Scandinavian cities like Stockholm or Copenhagen or Malmö is they experiment with different ideas and different approaches, and it's through that experimentation that they learn what is working, what's not working, because the way people want to get around a city is not always the way planners think people want to get around a city. So it's very much a process of trying things out, seeing what works and adapting from that. I think another thing we can say about cars, which is important to know, is a global trend, is that young people around the world are driving less. And certainly in the Western countries like Australia and the USA, there's fewer and fewer young people getting a driver's license, which is a fascinating trend that young people are actually moving away from cars as the primary thing you do the moment you turn 18 or 20 or whenever you can drive. So that's also pretty interesting. So there's some other trends happening around the world which are really important to when we talk about cars. I mean, the other trend, of course, is virtual meetings, which is something we work with here, which jumps quickly away from cars and transportation and talks about actually what we're doing right now. Is that instead of having everybody come to meet us here at Lund, we're obviously having a meeting online, and this is going to grow exponentially because there's just no way we can continue to move around the way we do with our global transportation systems. So, and these kind of meetings can be used very effectively to either within specific locations with people that might all be all in Sweden or all in the same city, or people all over the world. So that's kind of just another facet to this area of transportation.
And that's one way of decreasing the need to move in the city. Other ways is with urban planning, how to mix function in the same neighborhood, so you don't have to go to another neighborhood to do your shopping, for example.
And I think that's important. I think in the forums, there were a few people who said, you know, I live in suburban USA. It's not an option to go without a car. If they ban them, I can't get to work. So I think also the planning and the services need to be part of maybe the policies around limiting or making it less attractive, not just making it less attractive and harder for people, but making it easier in another way.
Yeah. And I think one of the questions here was what's politically viable, which is a really good question. And just to use an example from Sweden, the congestion charge in Stockholm was a charge put on cars going through the city of Stockholm. And what the city of Stockholm said they wanted to do was that they would test the congestion charge. Now, before the congestion charge was implemented, it was not very favourable. The surveys all showed that people didn't really want it. But of course, then they tested it and they ran it, and people got to experience the centre of Stockholm with less traffic. So those that were driving got around easier, and those that could get on public transport, they also found it pretty good. And then afterwards, the survey showed that people found it much more favourable. So this idea of what's politically viable and what's not politically viable is also connected to how you implement these different strategies within cities. And I think Stockholm showed that very, very clearly, that if you do it in a smart way, you can get people very much involved and engaged, because often when we remove cars from cities, they're much nicer places, let's face it. So, I mean, it's just that shift away from something we're very, very used to, the car, to something else which we're maybe not as used to.
So we have to have a reason to try it. And yeah, economic incentives and market-based instruments are something we're going to learn more about next week, but it's also an effective tool. And as you say, it has to be introduced well too, that there is an art to introducing new policies. And that's where maybe experiments and trials and pilots play a role with getting people to try something new. And then we see, this is a better solution for our city.
May I add one thing? No. Banning cars in themselves can be very problematic. We've seen examples in China where they've been banning cars with certain number plates and so on, which makes people buy twice as many cars so that they can go with a car with a different number plate on those days when that is allowed. So there is also a problem with perverse effects from some of these kind of policies. So you have to be very aware of that.
There has to be another way for people to do it that is perceived convenient and easy to use. Otherwise, they're going to find a way to circumvent the policy. Yeah, I think that's a good point. And we talked about some trends here. Another trend that we've been asked about, and the second question that we have today from our CTAs, is about this trend with urbanization, but also asking the question whether is it not more inherently sustainable to be living in a rural area? And that's a question that's been discussed, and it's been discussed why do we focus on cities when there's maybe a whole other 50% that don't live in cities? And why do we talk about cities here?
So much. I mean, I think Lena obviously introduced the topic of cities, and if you've been following the films in our course and reading our compendium, you'll know that there's more than 50% of the global population living in cities, and this is an extraordinary trend from that we used to live in rural areas to a trend where more and more people are living in cities, and this will continue throughout the century. We'll be moving to 60 or 70% of people living in cities, which is a massive change for our society and our economic development. And so I think it's important to realise that this trend, it's hard to see any reversing of this trend at this stage, that's for sure. I mean, we are living in the urban century, and we need to respond to those challenges. It doesn't mean that we forget everything that's happening outside cities. In fact, that's one of our problems, that when we move into cities, we become very disconnected to the land and all the things that make living in cities possible. So we actually need to reconnect to rural areas just as much as working with cities. And in fact, that rural city relationship is very, very important. But I think, just like you said, that living in rural areas is not inherently sustainable, and living in cities is not inherently unsustainable. In fact, cities can be very, very sustainable, and living in rural areas can also be unsustainable. So it's not a simple equation, that's for sure. And I think what we can also say is we have had a big focus on eco-villages for a long time, the idea that people move out to rural areas and set up villages that are highly sustainable, deep green. And these have been quite successful, but now what we're seeing a lot of is eco-districts, which is inside cities, like in Malmö with the Western Harbour, or in Stockholm with the developments there. You see districts being developed which really have strong sustainability ambitions. So kind of a shift to also, how do we create districts within cities that are sustainable, and then of course how does that spread across a whole city?
And I would say one of the advantages of urban areas, dense agglomerations, is that there is a very strong potential for living in a resource efficient way. If you live in a multi-residential instead of a single family home, that is more energy efficient way of living, and it's easier to transport yourself wherever you have to go without a car if you live in the city. So the potential is very big for living a resource efficient life. But on the other hand, there are challenges to this. There are some cities which are very poor from a sustainability perspective and doesn't offer this potential. And there's also that this urban lifestyle is sometimes connected with a very resource intensive lifestyle still. We consume a lot. There's a lot of this throwing things away, buying new things, or go on holidays. That culture might be stronger in urban areas. That's something you have to be aware of.
That might be part of this disconnect that Kaz is talking about. Maybe if you're living in a rural area and you see where your resources come from and where they go in a much more exposed manner, that you're more aware of them. Whereas, you throw them in a chute, as somebody, I think in the forums, they saw that, and it's away, and you don't have to think about it again. So maybe that's one of the challenges for urbanization, is to keep people connected and knowing where things are coming from and where they're going, even though they see them on a grander scale.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, this issue of consumption in cities is a huge issue, that we just have massive overconsumption in many cities around the world, and this kind of disconnect to where all that consumption, all those products have come from, for sure, is enormous. And just jumping to another topic, it's kind of interesting. Urban agriculture, which is popping up all over the world, is kind of interesting. Not so much from the perspective that people can that we can start feeding ourselves through urban agriculture, which is probably impossible, but the fact that it does reconnect people back to food and to growing food and where food comes from. And this can be particularly relevant for children and for families, and kind of growing up with kind of some sense that, you grow food and then you eat food, and that's, you have some kind of connection back to that, which is kind of interesting. And some people around the world are really looking at this and saying this is, could be something quite important, that urban agriculture could play a role there. Because I think in our eco districts now in Sweden, they're highly sustainable in terms of renewable energy or energy efficiency, and they're totally and utterly unsustainable in terms of consumption. So people have still got lots of TVs and computers and all kinds of devices, and still travel and still eat lots of meat. So there's a lot of work to go before they can be called sustainable communities or sustainable cities, that's for sure. But they're certainly, making strong attempts to be more sustainable.
But it seems like, as you mentioned at the beginning, that you can live unsustainably in a rural area, and you can live unsustainably in a city, and it's really about the choices that are made and the design of those communities in each place as well. Because we had some forum contributors saying, oh, well, it's better in the rural area because I can have my own garden. But then when you think about, if you make urban agriculture possible, you can have your own garden in the city as well, or maybe not your own, but pulled together where you're using it. But still, that experience doesn't have to necessarily be lost from moving to one to the other, and that we can have the best of both in both if we design it well.
But speaking of design, an important aspect when designing cities is the long lifetime of these infrastructures and how we lock in ourselves to a certain lifestyle. And that's why it's so important when we develop new areas, for example, to think of how can we make a sustainable infrastructure in the broad meaning, but how can this area allow for a sustainable way of living and encourage a sustainable way of living? Because how the area is planned, it's going to be like that for quite some time, maybe hundreds of years.
I think as well, we can also talk with the city kind of rural. We obviously have a huge focus on the big global cities. We have a big focus on cities like New York and London, and then the huge cities in China and India, where many millions of people are living. In fact, there are cities in China that are bigger than the whole of Sweden. So, but the thing is to keep in mind that actually most people are living in medium-sized cities, which is like 500,000 to 1 million or so people in the cities. So it's actually those medium-sized cities that are key players in global sustainability, that if we make those cities more sustainable, will be a long way towards kind of global sustainability. So the big focus on these larger cities is not the only area of urban development we should be talking about. We should definitely be talking about the different sizes of cities, and again, the relationship between those cities and the regions around them.
And what's possible at each one. Sometimes you hear about things that maybe aren't possible because of the size, but reading some of the assignments that have already come in, one of the assignments is about cities, and a lot of them that are coming in are not these big cities, but examples of smaller cities like Bergen in Norway, 300,000, and they're working on their public transport system. Whereas you might think, oh, is that enough for public transport? But yes, they're building their public transport and expanding it, so that's quite interesting. Or Lansing, Michigan is another that is an example, and these aren't huge cities that you hear about all the time. That's why it's so interesting to be reading some of these assignments. We're learning about cities we don't know of, that there are many more of these cities than the New Yorks and the Amsterdams, in the world. So
absolutely. And I think another point we can say why there is such a focus on cities is in relation to climate change and to the fact that the negotiations from national governments has been so slow. We've been working for 20 years to get a global agreement. We've obviously had a few agreements that have been pulled together, but it's very, very difficult for national governments around the world to make strong agreements, although we are beginning to see some very strong agreements from China and the USA and so on. But when we look at cities and some of the city strategies and visions, these visions are very different to the national visions is that first, they're in line with climate science. In other words, they're talking about 80% reductions in emissions or 100% renewable energy, which is very much in line with what scientists are saying we must do, and that cities are actively pursuing these paths. And that at a city level, there's obviously a bit more of a closeness between people living in the city and the businesses and of course the government. So cities have become kind of exciting focal points for action on climate change, whether from researchers' perspectives or industries or governments or people. So that's also why cities have taken a much kind of larger role. And I think throughout the coming decades, we'll see cities taking an even larger role in relation to climate change and climate change agreements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And I think another question that we have here related to the cities, I guess, of now and of the future, and what is the difference between a smart city and a green city?
Your question, Laura?
Smart city is quite a tricky concept. It's used in many different ways to promote different things. But one core aspect of the concept, I would say, is that you use IT to improve the city somehow. It might be improve it from a sustainability perspective, but not necessarily. So I think you have to, when you scrutinize different types of smart city concept, you have to be quite critical in this regard. What is it actually that this concept is encouraging? So about the difference, the core aspect of a smart city, I would say, is to use IT to improve it. The core aspect of a green city is environmental sustainability, along with the social and economic sustainability.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think that the smart city concept has become hugely popular, and particularly in Europe and Scandinavia, where of course there's big IT companies and big energy companies that can see enormous opportunities and potential to make money, but also to have huge energy efficiency gains and renewable energy. I mean, I heard it described by an industry representative as the smart city is an integration of energy infrastructure with IT infrastructure, that those two come together. And that I think that we're going to have smart homes and smart technologies that are all effectively talking to each other. The Internet of Things, where everything is communicating with everything, so that you can see the potentials there to be more energy efficient, for sure, that your different devices
main focus
talk
efficiency.
Talk to each other, exactly, and also the integration of renewable energy. So there's lots of potentials with the idea of smart cities. However, there's lots of challenges, of course. I mean, the idea that these technologies can just be rolled out and implemented smoothly is probably unlikely. There's also issues with that this involves lots of monitoring. You're going to monitor everything in a city, collect data on everything.
And the lights are going to know what I'm doing everywhere.
Everyone's going to know everything. And I know that in Australia, they've tried to install smart meters throughout Australia, and it's been a big challenge because people are very concerned about the data collected and so on and how that's going to be used. Whereas in Scandinavia, I think it's been a bit easier, but there's also some of these social and political issues around smart cities.
Smart meters, do all our course participants know what a smart meter is?
No, you can.
No?
What's a smart meter?
So that's a meter which in a pedagogical way explains to the energy user how the energy is used and possibly environmental impacts associated with that. So that's a way of addressing behavioral issues when it comes to energy consumption, to increase awareness and knowledge.
And the information then, I know how much I use when I turn on the TV and the light, and it might make me rethink some of my energy use.
Yes. Okay. But for sure the potential is huge. And when we talk about transitioning towards a low carbon electricity system, for example, we of course need these solutions. So maybe I sounded overly critical.
No,
I agree with you for that. For example, one important aspect here relating to the urban is how to use electric cars as batteries.
Yes.
So that you can store energy in them when we have a lot of energy production from the intermittent energy sources such as wind and solar, and how we can use that later on.
Yeah.
And a connection to that is the idea of smart grids that will be able to deal with different types of renewable energy and, of course, electric vehicles being plugged into them. So there's certainly in Europe and Scandinavia, many of these things are coming. I also have a feeling that in countries like China and India, we'll actually see the rollout perhaps even faster because they can implement these newer systems quicker, wherever we've got kind of established older systems. But I think, like, going back to the question, what's the difference between green cities and smart cities? I mean, there's many, like you said, many different interpretations of these, but the smart city is perhaps a more focused concept on IT and energy, and the green city is, of course, a much broader concept, very closely linked to sustainable development and sustainability. And what exactly we mean by a green city, it's not clearly defined, but that's also for a good reason, because there's not only one type of green city. I mean, there are going to be many different types and many different ways of getting there. And I hope that in this course, people have got that kind of message that we don't have a plan for a sustainable world or a plan for a sustainable city. We just have ideas and things that we need to experiment with. It is going to be very much a journey and a testing. And I think that's what's really exciting in Scandinavia, is that there is so much testing and experimenting going on. They're really trying things out to try to find their way to these future cities.
Yeah, and what works for one city may not be a solution for another. I think in one of the forums, the one size fits all was brought up.
Absolutely.
As it doesn't necessarily work, or that when we think about the different dimensions of sustainability, that also means that the context can determine what solutions work best in a different place too. So we think that one of the specific questions was, does a city need to be smart to be green? But when you're talking about being green, it sounded like you can still be green without the smart, or is it essential component, do you think?
I mean, I think the world we're living in, I mean, it's an extraordinary world where the internet is spreading everywhere. Mobile phones are spreading everywhere. I mean, it's even with enormous poverty in some parts of the world, we still see mobile phones and smart mobile phones spreading everywhere. And that effectively is smart infrastructure going everywhere. So I think that most of our cities are going to fit the smart city definition as we go forward into the future. We just had a meeting earlier today about something called the Goals, which is working with young people all around the world, and it's about sustainability education using mobile phones. And one of their main findings, of course, is that all these young people have mobile phones, and that so you can connect to them that way, even in all parts of the world. So I think that it will be hard to see too many green cities that aren't tapping into technologies. However, I can also see many cities deciding that their best way to move towards sustainability is not through technologies, but through social and political changes. They're just as important. And that's probably the danger, is to get too carried away with technologies will be the solution. And that in fact, it's not so much the technologies, but how we use the technologies, how we implement the technologies, and so on.
So we should be considering it as part of a green city, because the technology is coming and we can harness it one way or another, but we need to make sure that we're doing more than just the technology.
Yeah. And I mean, I think one more point I can say, which is exciting about smart cities, we're involved in several projects here in Malmö, and what the smart city concept does is it attracts the attention and brings in the big players. So we're in projects with IBM, E.ON, which is a huge energy company in Europe here, Siemens, I'm sure you've heard of them, Schneider Electric, all of these very, very big global companies that are in the town of Malmö, the city of Malmö, working there. Why would they be working there? Because they're seeing Malmö as a test bed, a place where they can test things, try ideas, see what works, see what doesn't work, and actually effectively take those lessons and spread them around the world if they work in certain ways. And I think that's what's exciting about smart cities, is that it brings in industry and business, and perhaps this is where the green economy takes that kind of nice position, that they can see a potential to make a lot of money, which is great because that's what they do, but also have a lot of fantastic impacts, very positive impacts from a sustainability sense. And so that's probably where the smart city and green city concepts come together quite nicely.
And you mentioned the word experiments, which is actually our last question here, about more examples in the forums that are being given from all over the world about experiments. But there was also the question of, okay, what more, we've seen some in this module, but what more is happening in terms of experiments here in Scandinavia, or that maybe we know of around the world too? I mean, related to the cars, there in that forum, there was an experiment in Bogota we read about, that they're doing car-free days once a year, and now they're looking at doing it once a month, and these kind of experiments. Do you know some other interesting experiments that are going on now, or ways of cultivating these experiments in Scandinavia?
It's a good question. I mean, how long do we have? We can talk for a long time, I think, about this, but I think, Nora, do you want to take one?
Yeah, well, for example, we could lift this area of the Western Harbour in Malmö, which is this newly developed area, in different phases. They started with one phase where they emphasized livability a lot. It was architecturally a very nice area, very accessible for people to come to. They also looked at energy issues and, for example, the energy consumption of building. When evaluating that area, it turned out that it was not very successful when it came to the energy performance of buildings. But when it came to the livability aspects, it's been very successful, for example. And this evaluation part is also really an important aspect of this area. So now when they go on with the next development phases in the Western Harbour, they learn from the first phases and bring lessons with them to the next phases. For example, they emphasize economic aspects and social sustainability to a larger extent, and they also try to improve in the succeeding experiments, as we would call, in terms of energy performance, for example. Another way where we look at how new infrastructures or new buildings interact with existing infrastructures and ways of doing things could, for example, be an area of single-family houses in Västerås called Herrgårdsängen, where they worked hard on developing a low-energy housing area, with combining that with district heating. In Sweden, district heating is quite a common way of heating buildings. It's considered quite sustainable, but it's kind of developed for buildings using a lot of energy. So it's a challenge to make this system come together with low energy housing. And that's what they're testing in this area and in other areas around Sweden.
Yeah, I mean, I think the example of the Western Harbour you started with, we put a film up, or there's a film in the guide about the Western Harbour from the BBC, and yeah, you can really get a picture of what's happening in that particular part of Malmö. And I think what's also interesting about the Western Harbour is it was one very big experiment, extraordinary experiment, which they've kind of, as you said, kind of gone along. But I think it's also helped to catalyse other experiments in Malmö. Like, it creates a kind of base for cities to do even more. And I think that Primoz in his film talks about sustainable neighbourhoods in the course as well. And I think that's where sustainable neighbourhoods, sometimes people think, why would you just start with a small part of a city? I mean, isn't that irrelevant? But it's in fact very, very relevant that if you can capture just part of a city and experiment with that part of the city, the good lessons from it can really flow both into organisations working in the city, but also to residents and so on. And you also have some lessons where you say, okay, we're definitely not going to do that again. That didn't work. So I think these kind of experiments are really, really valuable for cities. And I think the sustainable neighbourhoods or eco-districts actually are a great stepping point for almost all cities around the world, because in many cases we can't make these huge leaps to be working with entire infrastructure or so on, but we can work with different parts of cities. And I think I can give another example from the Western Harbour, which is a building which E.ON built. And E.ON is an energy company, and they built an apartment building with 8 apartments in it called Hållbarheten, which is my attempt at a Swedish word in Australian. But what's really interesting about this is that E.ON, as an energy company, doesn't normally build buildings. E.ON is interested in energy. So why did they build a building in the Western Harbour? They built it down there, and they built 8 apartments in there, and there were 8 different residents who they sold these apartments to. But these are very special apartments because they put in all kinds of smart technologies, which we just talked about before. The buildings look perfectly normal, but inside all of those walls is all these cables and all of these devices collecting extraordinary amounts of information. And what E.ON is interested in is how people live, and how people live and use energy. And you might think, well, doesn't an energy company know how we live and use energy? And surprisingly not. In fact, when you look at water companies, they know very little about how people use water. When you look at energy companies, they know very little about how people actually use energy. And when I mean the way people actually live. So they're particularly modern lifestyles. So they were extremely interested in this knowledge. And obviously this is very, very valuable to E.ON. And it's a fantastic example, again, of a company, a very big company, testing something out quite small, but you can see that the ramifications of these lessons could be enormous for how they do business. And I think they're more and more interested in those kinds of experiments where there's the use of technology, but a very big focus on our social lives and how we live.
Yeah, I think the social part is key to it as well. When we're talking about changing behavior is a big part of greening the economy too. And it's not as simple as maybe just having the information, but maybe it's also the energy company having the information to build a better infrastructure or services that allow us to bridge it, that we're not just changing our behavior, but we're also being allowed to change within our structure there as well. And I know that in the waste that's being used too, of what people do, we talked about, growing amounts of electronics in this course as well, and the small electronics, and what do people do with them at the end of life is another big question. And what is the most convenient thing for people to do at the end of life? Is it a curbside pickup? Is it driving it someplace? Well, not everybody has a car, so maybe there have to be other options. So there are experiments with taking it back to the grocery store and having some collectors there for small electronics and making it part of everyday life for people. They take back, you know, already here in Scandinavia, they have deposit refund we'll learn about next week. But there's a system of you go to buy groceries, but you're also bringing back your used cans, your used bottles, and now your used electronics to the grocery store, all in the same, you know, action.
And that links to another dimension of experimentation, I would say, because now we started on talking about physical structures and how you try to change physical structures. But another dimension of this is the governance experiments. How do cities or local governments experiment with new forms of incentivizing a more sustainable behavior? It can be through different types of regulation or through different types of dialogue where you bring different actors together to create a common vision. I think cities are really interesting in this regard also.
Yeah, it's a really good point, because we also have a film with Harriet Bulkeley from the UK speaking exactly about this topic, and it is a huge area that experiments in governance and how cities work with people and how you engage people and all the different actors, because it's not as simple as the local government is somehow running this. In fact, it's always about collaborations and governance. So.
And in Sweden, we see that the municipalities are quite, they're very proactive in this regard, and they kind of challenge also national governments in ways of in terms of authority, what can they do? How can they govern? And there can sometimes be a bit of a conflict between the local and the national, which might also bring us further in the end.
Yeah. So we see, I mean, bringing this back to some of the concepts we're using in the course too, that cities are not only a place where greening is taking place, like a context, but they're also drivers of greening processes, particularly when you have strong actors collaborating and you have a good group working together. You can gain a lot of momentum and make some changes that matter.
No, I mean, I think this week in this discussion, we've managed to mention all of the films we've talked about this week, almost. The one film we probably is just the visioning one, which we could maybe just say something about, because I think the visioning links to these experiments. I mean, I think what you see in Scandinavian cities is many kind of inspiring visions to have more attractive and sustainable and prosperous cities, and trying to create places where people really want to live and be, particularly in Denmark and Sweden and Norway as well, so across these countries. And I think the visioning processes should also not be downplayed, because one of the issues we have now is I think many people feel stuck in the world we live in. And it's hard to believe a world with not many cars, or it's hard to believe there could be a world which is super energy efficient and has huge amounts of renewable energy, but it's just as possible as the world we live in today. So I think that visioning processes are actually really important, that you bring people together and they think about the future they want, not the future that they're stuck with.
And you could tie that to an experiment. I think we have in the compendium, we linked to a reading about what they did with Times Square in New York, where they took away the cars for a few days and they reimagined it as a pedestrian street. They did it all with paint and with chalk, and then people could experience that vision. So it was first a vision, then it was an experiment, and now it's now a discussion of how do we make this a better place for people and not just for cars, which brings us back to even the first question. I think we might tie it up with that as well. We have a few housekeeping before we sign off here, but I think with our discussion of the module and going through the student questions, we had a very interesting discussion, so thank you both with that. In terms of this week, an important reminder that today is the assignment due date as well, and then we have a few hints as well with the assignment and reminders, not only that it's due today, but when you're submitting it, to make sure that you're also taking a look at the criteria on which your peers are going to be evaluating your assignment. So there were 4 criteria, and the 4 criteria was the first one talking about asking you to make sure that you write about the case study. So did you explain what the case is in terms of the product, in terms of the business, in terms of the city? And the second criteria was, did you talk about how that product or that business or that city lessens an environmental impact, or how it helps make some change, or it could be also a social impact. The third criteria is what we're finding the most people are struggling with, and that's where you explain, is this an example of greening of or greening by? And last week, Peter in the Hangout had actually talked through some examples of what we mean by greening of and greening by. And there's also a forum thread about this that can help maybe illustrate what we mean by greening of or greening by. But I can even show you one of the assignments here. We have one of the assignments already turned in has an example of phone blocks. I hope we can see that. Phone blocks, which is a phone that is designed as modules together. And in this case, they've explained it as an example of greening by, because phone blocks are revolutionary in their view and changing the phone industry in a way. This is a new kind of product that is advancing sustainability. You could also explain it as an example of greening of, that this is a mobile phone that is designed differently, so it is a greening of mobile phones. Either answer is fine. What needs to be there is that you've thought about it, that you've tried to explain it, that you've engaged with what is actually happening with this product, what is actually happening with this business, let's say, as well. So you could talk about mobile phones, and you can take another example of, I've seen somebody wrote about the Fairphone, which has a unique business model. So there also, you're having a greening of possibly a mobile phone, but also with that business, a greening by a business with a new innovative business model. So thinking through what it could be. And then we just talked about cities today, and we talked about how they can both be a context where greening takes place. So you can have greening of a city, or you can have greening by a city, where that city is implementing policies and being an actor or a driver, and what are they doing to drive the greening process. So do make sure that you engage with that one. And then the last criteria is to include a link or a source so that people can read more about it, or a picture so that they can visualize what you're writing about. And then we see some really nice case examples here. But overall, we've seen some really good assignments coming in. So keep up the good work. And it's really nice to see a lot of participation in the forums as well. And I think some of the most popular forums have been about the impact of the course, actually. And one with some of the most replies is how people are going to be greening their own lives and what they're going to be taking from the course. So that's really great to see, because I think the biggest part of greening is that we all need to be involved in it, and on any scale, as individuals, as cities that we've talked about today. And we'll be talking about what nations can do and the national policies next week. So we'll see you then, and thank you for joining us.
Very good. See you later.